In a knife fight with large knives, be it a traditional knife like this navaja or a bayonet, I recommend taking the hand. And I'm not the only one to recommend that either. We also find it in numerous martial arts, including various Filipino martial arts, and the works of Tony Biddle in Do or Die. I'm Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, and here I'm going to talk a little bit about a basic idea of knife fighting, large knife against large knife, which I personally use in my training with Bowie knife or trying to reconstruct Bowie knife fighting. But I have found exactly the same advice in World War II bayonet, used as a knife in hand, advice by Tony Biddle in Do or Die from 1944. So Tony Biddle was a absolutely legendary combat instructor to the US Marines. He was in the Marines himself, and he trained Marines for decades. He himself had studied fencing and bayonet fighting, jiu-jitsu, boxing. In fact, he was a very prolific boxer himself as well. All over America and also in Europe as well. He had actually trained fencing in both Britain and France, and he trained bayonet certainly in France as well as America under numerous experts. And he basically ended up being one of the chief close combat training instructors to the US Marines for quite a few years, essentially, and trained, I think he claims to have trained in the region of about 150,000 US Marines. Now, bear in mind, this is at the time of the Second World War. His first edition of the book Do or Die was actually published in 1937, so before America, well before America joined the war, but everyone knew the war was coming. And in fact, the second edition, which I've been reading, is from 1944. So it was updated with some additional advice and tweaked, and additions made at the beginning as well in terms of the forewords. And that was published in 1944. So you've got to remember, this is a time when the US Marine Corps and, you know, the whole of the US military structure, and of course British and various others, were deep in war. This was the final bloody stages of World War II. And they're completely candid about the fact that, you know, hand-to-hand combat fighting still happened, but your primary goal as an infantryman was to be using your firearm. Yes, you shoot people. That's what you're there primarily to do, is to shoot people. But they also conceded that there were many benefits to teaching US Marines and all other types of soldiers at that time close combat. Not only the fact that they might use it, but also it trains them to be have a greater degree of athleticism, be more physical, be more assertive, be more confident, teach them how to close with the enemy, take ground, and this kind of stuff. So there are many aspects to it, and I've spoken about this in many previous videos, but it's not only about the close combat training, it's also about the mentality. However, it is also about the close combat training. We have to remember that knives were used at this time, and in fact Biddle makes an interesting comment. In the bit that he wrote before 1944, the bit that he wrote in 1937, this is before the Second World War, you've got to remember that America did have colonial concerns, like lots of other countries at that time, like Britain, like France, Spain, Portugal. And he does note that knives were very prolific in some of the places that the US military personnel, the US Marine Corps in this case, could find themselves serving. Most famously, somewhere like the Philippines, for example. And he does point out that there are situations in where you're just stationed, where you might find yourself being attacked by a knife attacker. So don't always think about fighting Nazis or fighting Japanese infantrymen. It was also about the soldier being a well-rounded combatant and being able to defend themselves against someone who might attack them with a knife. Now, there's also another interesting note in Biddle, and that is, this is a bayonet. So this is a British SMLE bayonet. Although this is famous from World War I, and this is a World War I example, these were also used in World War II. And in fact, there are some similarities with bayonets that the Americans were using. I actually don't own any American bayonets, so I've grabbed this one for illustrative purposes. And they vary in size. However, they're all fairly large. They're all comparable to larger Bowie knives than this. So this is more like a hunting knife size Bowie knife. Really, the minimum bayonet size that you get in World War II are really the size of this large boar hunting knife, or indeed larger Bowie knives, and things like the Spanish navaja, and bigger. And this bayonet, the SMLE, and in fact the US Remington bayonet, for example, have got fairly long blades. So when you've got a blade of this size, it becomes an implement that obviously you can stab very effectively with it, but you can also chop with it because it's a decent size. And that of course is true of things like Bowie knives and navaja and bolos and things like this. So it does change, the repertoire does change between a smaller knife and a larger knife, and this is what I would call big knife fighting system. But he makes the interesting note that if the US soldier, US Marine Corps or any other, is attacked by someone with a knife who wants to kill an American, then in that instant they might be able to get their knife out and use it in hand as a knife. They might not be able to fit it to their bayonet and use it on, or fit it to their rifle rather, and use it as a bayonet on the end of the rifle. So very often bayonets did get used as large fighting knives. Now there's therefore a lot of parallels between what was come up with knife use in World War II, at least for large knives, a bit different to something like the Fairbairn-Sykes dagger, but for large knives, and earlier systems that we see used. Now, it's no coincidence therefore that Biddle himself actually went out west and studied Bowie knife methods, and in fact he incorporated what he regarded as Bowie knife fighting methods in his system for World War II combatives. So here we have a direct or indirect, that's debatable, a direct or indirect, but certainly a connection, or at least a claimed connection, by Tony Biddle between what he was teaching to the US Marine Corps in 1944 and potentially Bowie knife techniques that go all the way back to the late 1800s, perhaps even earlier, perhaps the mid 1800s, because at the end of the day, how many different things can you actually do with a Bowie knife? And it has to be said that these techniques, as they are presented in his book, are fencing techniques. So anyone who does sabre or rapier or even foil and épée will be familiar with some of the techniques he uses for knife. Now, I started off this video by mentioning take the hand. What am I talking about? So when I run Bowie knife classes, one of the primary things I teach people to do is to counter against stab with a cut to the hand. Now, a lot of people might look at a big knife like this or the navaja and see it as a big chopping implement. And yes, they can chop. However, they've also got nice pointy bits on them. And a lot of attacks, and a lot of the most efficient and effective attacks, will be stabs with the point, okay? It's no coincidence that in even going all the way back into the Renaissance, some places specified that you had to clip the tip or break the tip off your knife to be able to legally carry it around. Because yes, you could slash people up with it, but the fact is that the point is most likely to result in death. I think most people here know that thrusts are more often fatal than cuts. Moreover, if we're in a place with heavy clothing, such as military uniforms, like greatcoats and stuff like this, like the First World War, then stabs are more adept at getting through them than chops and cuts are. Okay, so for those reasons, thrusts are often the primary attacks. However, cuts are brilliant to be used as defensive attacks. What do I mean by that? Let's just grab the Bowie for a second. So if someone is attempting to stab you from any angle in any way with their knife, and it doesn't have to be a Bowie knife, it could be a kitchen knife, it could be any type of knife. If you have a blade over a certain length, and I have spoken about this in previous videos, I consider that length to be 6 or 7 inches. Below 6 or 7 inches, I class it as a smaller knife, and above that, I class it as a bigger knife. Why? It's to do with margins of error. It's to do with having a long enough blade that you can reliably hit an incoming hand or wrist, knuckles, whatever, with the edge of your blade. Now, you might start off on guard with your point on line because your primary attacking method is stabbing. But if the opponent stabs at you, yes, you could counter stab, and we'll talk about that in a future video, but you could deal with their attack just by chopping into their arm. Now, chopping into hands and arms is an idea that goes all the way back to the beginning of bladed weapons. It probably goes all the way back to sticks, actually, okay? And it's just based on the simple principle of distance. If your opponent is trying to reach you here, you can reach their arm before they reach you here, because the arm being extended is going to be further forward than their body. So for them to reach, assuming we've got similar length arms, for them to reach me, I can hit their arm before it gets to me, or even better, I would say, move backwards and offline, move out of distance as they come in to give their attack, move out of the way and offline and countercut their arm. We find this in medieval treatises with the Langmesser, with the longsword. We find it in side sword, explicitly mentioned by Manciolino, saying you offend the thing that offends you the most, that is their hand, because the hand holds the weapon. We find it in Filipino martial arts, we find it in Japanese martial arts. It's pretty much a universal principle. But Biddle has some interesting words to share on it as well. Let's see what Biddle says. So Biddle considered this technique as fundamental, as do I, but he also considered it as swordsmanship and something only known by swordsmen and not necessarily your typical person out in the forest who might attack you with a knife, which is an interesting concept I'd not really thought of before. But he says the hand cut is particularly prescribed for use with the bayonet as a knife. That means using the bayonet as a knife in hand, and is an exquisitely scientific movement taken from the sword and known to few others than scientific swordsmen. The skilled épée fencer or duelist thrusts at the sword hand and arm of his opponent. True facts. The scienced broadswordsman, that means sabreur, essentially, a person using a sabre, cuts or thrusts at the sword, hand and arm. Very true, we do a lot of that. When time does not permit the attachment of the bayonet to the rifle, as I mentioned before, or when the bayonet is worn in the belt and no rifle is carried, because you might not always be carrying a rifle around, it is prescribed to use the bayonet as a disarming weapon against the armed adversary, that is, to hit their arm, literally to disarm them. In fact, with a quick cut to the opponent's knife-holding hand, it is possible for the bayonet thus used to disarm several in a group of attacking knifemen. Now that's a very interesting concept. Again, I'd never explicitly thought of that. So in other words, if a bunch of people are trying to stab you in the body, if you keep moving out of distance and slashing at their incoming hands and arms, you stand a chance of being able to hit their hands or arms whilst they are out of distance to hit your body. In other words, you can occupy them. You could say this also relates to something like montante or spadone theory as well. There are various methods of wielding the knife in the many respective countries where the dagger is publicly and generally recognised as a standard weapon, and the overhand guard and stroke and the underhand guard and stroke are separately characteristic to particular races and are standardised and correct. So he then goes into talking about different tendencies in different cultures and different martial arts in different places. But I think it's really fascinating that Biddle in World War II come to exactly the same conclusion as me, basically, that anybody who's trained to use swords, once you get something in your hand which is long enough to use as a mini sword, a Langmesser, anything that's big enough to be used as a mini sword and chop into an incoming limb with some reliability, that is one of your surest defences against someone trying to stab you with a knife. Distance management is massively important, so never underestimate it. Not only about moving the weapon, it's about moving your body and feet as well. But keeping the correct distance and chopping at their incoming hand or arm basically is your best way of defending against their stabs. Also note that this motion, although it's best done with a chopping implement, like a bayonet or a knife, it can be done with a stick, an umbrella, a bottle, a book, possibly, various other things. It doesn't have to be done with a knife in hand. It can be done, the same type of defences can be done, although it's obviously more potent with something which has a sharp edge all up it. But things can be improvised to do the same types of techniques. Now, completely aside from this technique done particularly with things like the Langmesser and Dussac in the medieval treatises, we also find, even with a rondel dagger, which can't really chop or slash in the same way, certainly not with the same effectiveness, and not against long medieval sleeves with multiple layers, we do find the same idea done, for example, in Fiore and various other sources, where the rondel dagger is supported with the arm and used to intercept the incoming arm, using it kind of like a miniature half sword. And this is kind of the same theory, because you're moving offline and out of distance and intercepting the incoming hand or arm that offends you. So to conclude, there we go, we can look at World War II knife usage, and it links very inextricably strongly to things like Spanish Navaja and Bowie knife that was being done in the 19th century, used with, similar cut and thrust blades. It links to medieval sword systems, Renaissance side sword, medieval Langmesser. It relates to all kinds of stuff which have similar considerations. You've got a basic technique that is a great bit of advice and a very simple technique you can teach to anybody very quickly, and you can massively increase their chances of survival just with a tiny bit of training, there is a fundamental basic thing there which is applicable across the centuries. You could apply it to the Roman gladius, you can apply it to Filipino weapons, Japanese weapons, Chinese weapons, European weapons, modern world weapons, it doesn't matter. And this advice runs all the way through those, and it still works as well today as it would have done in World War II or in the 15th century. But I also think that nugget of information that Biddle gives about this being something scientific or something a trained person might think of or be taught to do is also very interesting, and I think actually correct. I think the majority of people who are just madly shanking away are not necessarily going to be thinking about the fact that the person who backs off slightly or comes offline and whacks them hard in the incoming arm is basically going to completely lop half their hand or arm off and probably finish the fight pretty much there, okay, because having done that you can then follow up with a stab to the face or whatever. So a basic technique, yes, but not so basic that it's necessarily natural to the majority of people who are just using a knife. So incredibly important for you to know, and I think fascinating that this is a technique that spans across the continents and across the centuries. Thanks a lot for watching. I'm Matt Easton. I'll see you again really soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.